everyone. Welcome to our webinar today. The topic for today's webinar is incorporating equity into state offshore wind policies and programs. We have a really exciting lineup of speakers today, and we'll introduce them to you in a moment. This webinar is being presented by the Clean Energy States Alliance, also known as CESA. And to tell you more about CESA, I'm going to pass it over to my colleague now, Sam Schacht. Sam, over to you.
Thank you very much, Sam Donalds, and good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here. And I'd also like to extend a warm welcome to today's webinar, Incorporating Equity into State Offshore Wind Policies and Programs. And we have a really exciting panel discussion coming up for you today, so please look forward to that. And first, I'd just like to start off and explain exactly who the Clean Energy States Alliance is. So CESA is a national nonprofit coalition of public agencies and organizations working together to advance clean energy. Most of our members are state agencies, and we work to help states advance their clean energy policies and facilitate dialogue between states and our other members. And now I'd like to introduce you to our panelists for today. So first up, we have Jess Deely, Senior Policy Advisor for Offshore Wind at NYSERDA. Jess leads stakeholder outreach as well as workforce development liaison efforts for New York State's offshore wind program. Previously, Jess worked for the startup Own Energy, then EDF Renewables, and then Atlantic Shores Offshore Wind, where she led external affairs. Prior to her career in renewable energy, Jess worked as an award-winning on-air meteorologist and news reporter, and Jess holds a bachelor's in meteorology and climatology and a master's in environmental geoscience from Mississippi State University. Joining Jess today is Bob Snook from Connecticut. Bob has over 30 years experience in government in the energy field, working with regulators, transmission companies, generators, and grid operators. He is currently the Transmission Program Coordinator for the Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, and also serves on the United States Department of Energy's Technical Review Committee, providing peer review of DOE's National Transmission Needs Assessment, National Transmission Plan, and the Atlantic Offshore Wind Transmission Study. And rounding out our panel today is Marion Swain from the Massachusetts Department of Energy Resources. Marion is Deputy Director of Policy and Planning at MADOER, where her work focuses on electricity policy, markets, and decarbonization. She manages DOER's collaboration with Massachusetts electric utilities on competitive offshore wind solicitations, provides policy planning and direction on retail and wholesale electricity market issues. She also serves on the Interagency Global Warming Solutions Act team and contributed to the Massachusetts 2050 Decarbonization Roadmap. Marion holds a master's degree in city planning from MIT and a BA from Tufts University. And now I'm going to turn it over to CESA's Project Director for Solar and Offshore Wind, Vero Bourg-Meyer, who's also my colleague, to talk about our Offshore Wind Accelerator project and our recent report, which is partly the subject of this webinar. So take it away, Vero.
All right, thank you, Sam, and thank you everyone for being here. Thank you for our panelists. We're certainly in good company. So Sam, if you want to advance the slide to the next one so that we can start talking about the kind of context for today's webinar. So our work at CESA on offshore wind falls within what we're calling the Offshore Wind Accelerator Project, or OWAP. And the goal of OWAP, the general objective, is really to support the development of the offshore wind market and to inform the policies that enable a just transition to clean energy. So you can see on the slide here, there's kind of three buckets of people that we interact with. The first bucket is state energy agencies and states in general, not just the energy agencies, but also departments of commerce and labor and others that are relevant in this context. The second is community-based organizations, or CBOs, and the third one is the public. And obviously, this webinar falls within that third category, as well as in the first category. Next slide, please. So within OWAP, we have a couple projects that are all related, but this one particularly on offshore wind and equity is really organized around two tracks. The way you can think about it, and what's on the slide here, is that we do kind of four things that are in a continuum, really. It goes from trying to understand what the issues are, to trying to understand what some of the solutions might be, to communicating around those issues and those solutions, and to try to produce and disseminate as a result some best practices and tools. So the two tracks that we're following at CESA really are one track focused on the community-based organization, one track focused on the states. So we've been hosting for the past year something called the Scoping Dialogue on offshore wind and equity. And it's called a scoping dialogue because really we are scoping out these issues, trying to understand what the issues are, what the community needs are, and how the states may or may not be already addressing them, and what the states are doing, right? So on the community front, we've recruited some partners to help us really define, or rather for us to help them bring to the fore the community the issues that they see as critical in the context of the development of offshore wind, of the industry as a whole. And then the second track is really focused on the states and trying to understand what the states are doing. And we had this very first working group meeting with the states where they came along, and 11 states up and down the coast, on both coasts. And they started talking about all the things they were doing, the programs, the policies, and then at the end of that meeting, we received a lot of emails saying like, oh, that was actually really helpful to see in one place what everyone's doing. We haven't done that really before. And so that's how the idea for the report got started. And I should say that this scoping dialogue, this effort, generally speaking, this work on offshore wind and equity is funded by the Power Foundation and the Energy Foundation. And that's really helped us bring those two groups together into one forum, right? Really the main goal is for the CBO's track and the states track to get together and to hash it out. What is it that we need? What is it that's happening? So next slide, please. So the report that you see here on the cover, which is on this slide, is really the result of collaborative work, several months of collaborative work. All of these agencies that are listed were, I'm not going to go through them, you can read them, were involved in either interviews or reviewing or editing, or otherwise supporting the information gathering stage of this effort of offshore wind and equity. And all of these are also participating, generally speaking, in the scoping dialogue, and we'll be meeting with a group of community-based organizations that we've otherwise been working with to hear from them and really define some of the questions that should be addressed by the states. So you can go and consult that report. I encourage everyone to read it. It is, I don't think it's light material, but I do think it's really interesting, and it is the first time that it's been done, that this information's been thematically organized and all in one place for the public. We hope it's going to be a helpful resource for both the communities and the states. Next slide, please. So in this report, generally speaking, you'll hear both the communities and the state will have a tendency to think and to speak about this issue around kind of three big buckets. These are supply chain, workforce, and community engagement. And we decided to organize the report a little bit differently, and you'll see this. We wanted to organize it along the development process of an offshore wind project. And we also wanted to highlight some of the areas where both communities and states had the potential for interventions, right? Particularly the states. And so these are listed here. These are the energy planning process, procurement, state investment and information, and equity goals development. So the goal of today's webinar is really to go a little bit deeper into some specific aspects of the report. And so I'll send it back to Sam to start this conversation with. I think Jess Daly from NYSERDA is coming first. And thank you again for participating in this webinar. And obviously, thank you to our states for their participation in the project as well.
Thank you very much, Vero. And I wanted to just quickly again thank Bob, Marion, and Jess for being here today, and also remind the audience that if you have any questions about what any of our panelists present today, or if you have a question for Vero or I about the report, please feel free to put it in the chat. We're going to hopefully have around 15 to 20 minutes for questions after the panel, so that you're able to also contribute to the hour that we have together. So as I mentioned, the first question is for Jess. One of the standout features of NYSERDA's approach to offshore wind policy has been the way that NYSERDA actively sought and incorporated community engagement and participation. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about how community and stakeholder engagement and participation shaped New York's offshore wind policies.
Sure, I actually sent in a few slides to help back me up, and I'll be honest, I'm at the office today and something is happening with our wireless internet, and so I've moved rooms in hope that it improves, but if I freeze, hopefully I'll come back. So just in terms of how NYSERDA has considered community engagement input into our policies, I think the most important thing to note first and foremost is our Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. We call it our Climate Act, or the CLCPA, you might have heard. And I do apologize, I can't see who all is on the line, so I don't know how familiar this particular audience is with that law. So I'm just going to break it down slightly in terms of what has been done since the law has been passed, in terms of community engagement, and as well as a little bit more about how we're incorporating community engagement into the procurement and development of, and even operation of, offshore wind. So this is a new technology for me. Let me see if I can do it. Okay, I do have control. That's wonderful. So if you're not familiar with our Climate Act, a quick overview is it's one of the most aggressive climate laws in the nation in terms of our goals. We are trying to achieve 70% renewable energy by 2030 and 100% zero emission electricity by 2040. It sets us on a path to carbon neutrality, and it has a lot of commitments to environmental justice, disadvantaged communities, and a just transition, because as you can tell by the title, including the Community Protection Act into the Climate Leadership Act, it marries environmental justice with our clean energy transition. So one of the things that occurred out of the Climate Act was the creation of the Climate Action Council. Oh, excuse me, here's a quick look at our overall timeline, just in case you're wondering how we're going to get to an 85% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions as a 85% reduction from our 1990 levels into 2050. So you can see in there my expertise and my team that I work on is the offshore wind team, and we have been tasked with developing and connecting 9,000 megawatts of offshore wind by 2035. So for the Climate Act provisions, again, the Climate Action Council was created, and that Climate Action Council is comprised of several different New York State agencies, governor appointments, 3 Senate majority appointments. It's a very impressive council, and what I really want to pull out of this slide is just the creation of the working groups, because that further incorporates community engagement into the creation of what is called a scoping plan. So the Climate Action Council was created to create that scoping plan, and the scoping plan is essentially how New York State is going to reach the Climate Act's goals by those timelines that are negated into law. So it's kind of like, how are we actually going to achieve this? How are we going to do that? And we did create a draft scoping plan. It was released on December 30th, 2021, and that initiated a 6-month public comment period. And after hearing testimony at 11 public hearings across the state and receiving more than 35,000 written comments, the council considered the feedback, heard further analytical information on that draft scoping plan, and consulted with the Climate Justice Working Group in creating the recommendations within the scoping plan. So you can bet this has been a tremendous effort of public engagement and public consideration into how the state is going to transition to a clean energy economy. Those working groups, again, just to point out, they do have members of NYSERDA, PSC, the DOL, but we also have members of environmental justice groups and environmental justice representatives and upstate urban representatives within the working groups themselves that help to voice the concerns or the input of broad communities. I mentioned a little bit about this before. This is just a quick slide that we can provide for anybody that was interested in seeing the incredible amount of public engagement that went along with creating our scoping plan. Again, over 35,000 written comments, but it resulted in a scoping plan that has now been released to the public that prioritizes climate justice, job creation, cost reductions, public health benefits, and minimizes emission leakage. So it certainly transitions us from where we are now to where we want to be with New Yorkers first and foremost. And, you know, again, they helped write this scoping plan. And it was just a tremendous achievement for the state that has just now been released. So outside of the Climate Act and our scoping plan being affected by community input, I wanted to focus on what we're doing in offshore wind in terms of community engagement. So within offshore wind, if you're not familiar with New York State's current portfolio, we have 5 projects under contract. One is a small one, South Fork Wind Farm. It's actually a LIPA contract, not a NYSERDA contract, which is why you don't see it listed there on the side. But that's slated to be in operation by the end of the year. It's under construction right now. And then our broader, larger contracts, we had a 2018 solicitation which selected Empire Wind 1 and Sunrise Wind, and then a 2020 solicitation selecting even larger projects with Empire Wind 2 and Beacon Wind. And the map on the left-hand side here shows the harbors that are going to be built out to support these projects, be it shipping out pieces of tower or cable or operation and maintenance. You can also see substations where these projects will connect. So there will be a lot of construction going around the right-of-ways leading into these projects. So all of those onshore spots really require a great deal of community engagement. And not only that, but we want, in our state, we want to see more than just clean electrons, right? We want to see economic benefits for the state, and that's what's written into our policies. So we're not just buying energy projects based on, you know, how cheap it is. Of course, that's 70% of our overall scoring, but we also factor in economic benefits and viability. And these are just a few factors there at the bottom that we consider when we buy these projects. In the projects place a premium on transparent stakeholder engagement, because we want the communities that will be impacted or affected by offshore wind to have a major say in the development and construction and operation of those projects. So again, this is how we score our solicitations, which are actually due. We get our bids in tomorrow, so it's a very exciting time at NYSERDA. And I'll just again say, for the first time, we're now quantifying stakeholder engagement within those bids, as well as workforce and job plans. So we want to see that developers are taking into account stakeholder feedback and how that changes their project dynamics. I'm going to skip over the stakeholder engagement time slide right here, which is just basically backing up what I've said thus far, but that's it for me. I know I gave you a lot in terms of how we consider community outreach and our statewide policies, as well as our solicitations, but I look forward to the conversation, and I'm happy to answer any questions that arise.
Thank you very much, Jess. And of course, if anyone, you know, thinks of a question later for Jess, they should feel free to put it in the chat. There will hopefully be quite a bit of time at the end for us to talk about that. And so moving on, next up, we have a question for Bob Snook. And my question to you is this. Building new transmission is a crucial part of moving much of the East Coast's electricity generation towards offshore wind. And Connecticut has been instrumental in pushing for a more regional approach to offshore transmission planning. So I was wondering if you could talk about why regional collaboration is so important and how you and several other New England states are trying to make transmission planning a priority and also more equitable.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank CESA for the extraordinary work they've done in this report and also for convening this webinar. I would like to point out that the state of Connecticut and the other New England states, including Massachusetts, of course, embarked on the New England Energy Visions a little over 2.5 years ago. This was a deliberate and collaborative effort to bring the state governance together on transmission issues and to start a dialogue. These New England Energy Visions had a series of issues, one of which was transmission both onshore and offshore, because it was believed, and still is believed, it will not be possible to transition to a clean energy future without addressing the transmission issues first, since it takes so much longer to do transmission than generation. As part of this, of course, we've had recent an RFI for information on transmission build out for offshore wind. And then I can say today we had a press release which announced that last Friday concept papers were filed by Connecticut on behalf of the New England states with the Department of Energy to explore the possibility of funding for a series of major transmission developments off the Atlantic coast of southern New England. One of the reasons, there are several reasons we've done this in a regional fashion. The first is that it's simple economies of scale. We have found over the years as we've done clean energy procurements that we can get better ratepayer benefits by larger projects and by working together as a region as opposed to individual states. And that has led to each of our procurements having actually better prices than the one before, which improves things for ratepayers and particularly the consumers of energy products in New England. In addition, doing things collaboratively avoids the problems of states thinking basically parochially, that, you know, we have an offshore wind leasehold, let's just grab it for Connecticut or for Massachusetts or something like this. Working together as a region, since we are a regional grid, has made it much more efficient to do proactive and scenario-based planning. It aligns functionally our interests of our states with the interests of our consumers and makes it actually easier for the developers to work with us as well. In addition, it sends a huge message to developers. They see the states are serious. That helps them to get financing, helps them to come up with really good proposals which benefit everyone. Also, to be honest, our federal partners, the Department of Energy and the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, have been very interested in having multi-state and full regional efforts. Again, it's much more efficient. We get much better projects. And additionally, it's helped the states to really focus and engage in equity and environmental justice concerns from the day one. When the New England Energy Visions team was put together, environmental justice was one of the 4 major points that it had to be considered, because traditionally the burdens of transmission infrastructure have been placed on the overburdened and underserved communities in New England and elsewhere. By using offshore wind, we can actually affect equity concerns in at least 3 different ways. First of all, much of the infrastructure is now going to be at sea and will not have directly affect the land-based communities that have been traditionally overburdened. In addition, our states have, for example, in Connecticut, we have CEJAC, the Connecticut Environmental Justice Advisory Committee, which is directly involved in all aspects of our procurement efforts and reviews them. And state law requires us to consider equity and environmental justice and affordability in our procurement efforts. And then finally, the DOE funding that we're applying for includes Justice 40 requirements and a community benefit plan. By doing this cooperatively as 6 states acting together, we can actually affect and provide environmental justice and equity benefits for the entire region.
Thank you very much, Bob. That was really, really interesting. And it's also really exciting to hear about the concept paper that was just submitted. So the final question is going to be for Marion from the Massachusetts Department of Energy Resources. And Marion, Massachusetts has done a lot of work to try to ensure that offshore wind development benefits vulnerable and disadvantaged communities. Can you talk some about the work that MADOER has done to evaluate offshore wind developer bids and work with developers to make offshore wind development more equitable?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, CESA, for bringing us all together and for this great report. There's a lot of ways that Massachusetts has been working to further environmental justice and diversity, equity, and inclusion goals in our offshore wind work. And so I'll mostly be speaking about what we at the State Energy Office have been working on, but I'll note, you know, it's really a multi-agency effort in terms of the state side. We have the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center, which folks are likely familiar with. They do a ton of great work on equity and offshore wind and through kind of grant making, working with industry and workforce groups. We also have an entire environmental justice team in our secretariat who we work closely with and who are really engaged working with community-based organizations and kind of have their ear to the ground with the stakeholder community in Massachusetts. So we all work really closely on these issues together as it relates to offshore wind. But my office, DOER, we work with our utility companies on the actual offshore wind procurements that we run. And so we are similar to, as Nyserta was talking about, we're not just evaluating offshore wind projects based on their price. Obviously, we want to see, you know, cost-effective pricing, but we are also evaluating these projects on a variety of qualitative factors. And ever since kind of our first round of offshore wind procurements in Massachusetts, ensuring that, you know, these are projects that are responsibly sited and are producing economic benefits has been a key focus. And I think we've been proud to expand that and to strengthen the components related to environmental justice and DEI as we've iterated. We are approaching now our fourth round offshore wind procurement in Mass. And so I can talk a bit about in our last round some of the new things that we did to include EJ and DEI stuff. So one thing we did first of all was we put our request for proposals for offshore wind projects out for public comment. So this is, you know, the document that governs what the information we're gonna get from offshore wind companies who want to bid to our process. And so we put that out for stakeholder comment to try to get feedback. And we got some great response from environmental justice groups, advocacy organizations, the developers themselves, obviously. And a lot of that was really helpful in providing suggestions and recommendations about how to incorporate environmental justice considerations. So ultimately, the RFP that we put together with the utilities for our last round procurement did include new provisions that required bidders to describe firstly, how they're going to make sure to avoid and minimize any negative impacts on environmental justice communities, but also how they would, you know, positively direct the benefits of their project to environmental justice communities and other disadvantaged groups. So that's looking not only at kind of the siting side and making sure that the project is responsibly sited and not causing any negative impacts on, you know, overburdened communities, but also that the benefits of the project, like in terms of jobs and economic development initiatives, making sure that's also flowing to disadvantaged communities. So that was a new provision that we added. And related to that, we also had bidders submit a diversity, equity, and inclusion plan, which would describe how they plan to kind of direct the workforce benefits, for instance, of their project to minority, women-owned businesses, veteran-owned businesses, and other historically disadvantaged groups. And this was something where we had really beneficial collaboration with our colleagues at the Supplier Diversity Office. It's called in Massachusetts. I think a lot of states have different versions of this, but they do a lot of work to support minority-owned businesses and make sure that they are getting access to economic opportunities. So we coordinated with them to make sure that, you know, we're seeing the workforce benefits of offshore wind projects flowing to minority-owned businesses as well in terms of supply. So those are a couple of the new provisions that we had in our last round RFP. And many of these also now have been kind of memorialized into our official statute that governs how we do these procurements and expanded on. So our legislature has also been playing a key role in furthering these goals with our offshore wind procurements. And I think one last thing I would mention is, you know, as we were thinking about our role in this process, you know, definitely how we shape the RFP sends a message to the industry of what we want to see from these projects, and we evaluate them based on their responses. But then when we select a project, we also want to make sure that, you know, we're tracking and reporting on the commitments that they made. So our office, DOER, we executed memoranda of understanding with the selected offshore wind projects from our last round that basically outlined a strategy where they'll submit an annual report to us that'll have numbers about the jobs created, how many of those are in environmental justice communities, how many of those are going to minority-owned businesses, that sort of thing, to provide some accountability and tracking so that we're working collaboratively to make sure that all the great commitments that we evaluated, are really being realized over the course of this. These are long-term projects. Obviously, when a bid is selected, it's usually at a very early stage, hasn't, begun construction or anything like that. So those MOUs were a way that we also did for the first time to kind of make sure that we're able to track and memorialize those commitments from the bidders regarding economic benefits, DEI plans, and environmental justice impacts. So that was something we were excited to incorporate in our most recent round as well. I'll pause there. Hopefully that's a helpful overview.
I think that was very, very helpful, Marion. And we have a few questions that have come in, but I'd like to invite everyone once again to ask any questions as they come to mind. So Marion, you're here, and you just talked a lot about ensuring that jobs end up going to local and environmental justice communities. But I will invite, after you answer this, I will invite other panelists to answer this about their own states if they'd like to. But the question is just, what law exists to ensure that offshore wind jobs go to local resident and EJ communities?
Yeah, great question. So I think I mentioned that as like a little teaser, but we had a big climate law that was passed in 2022 in Massachusetts that covered a variety of clean energy initiatives, but part of it was also making changes to the statute that governs how we do these offshore wind procurements. And so part of that statute was actually including provisions to ensure that these types of factors, like benefits to minority-owned businesses, are enshrined in the law around how these procurements are structured. So there are new provisions now that will govern offshore wind procurements moving forward to ensure that preference is given to proposals that are, minimizing all these socioeconomic negative impacts, like on, federally acknowledged tribes, on the fishing industry. The statute also requires preference for projects that support community benefits and workforce development agreements between the developers for the construction of the project, and that benefits are flowing from the employment for the project to certified minority and women-owned small businesses. And there's several other provisions there, but those are just a few of the ways that the legislature has responded on this topic to kind of enshrine these considerations and make sure that they're given preference in the actual procurement process.
Great, thank you so much. And I was actually wondering, there was a follow-up question about a certain percentage guarantees in terms of jobs, but I wanted to actually turn this question to Jess. And if Jess, you could talk a little bit about what New York has done, and specifically New York's Climate Act does around ensuring benefits to disadvantaged communities with the 35%, similar to the Justice 40.
Yeah, indeed, it's a complicated question, and one that we are still figuring out as a state, honestly. So if you look at our current solicitation that is on the street, we added, similar to what Marion was saying, we put out a draft RFP before we released our full RFP for public comment. And we received, over 100,000 different comments on how to improve and incorporate different aspects of all sorts of different topics within the development range. But for environmental justice in disadvantaged community benefits alone, we created a new appendix that you can find on our solicitation page, Appendix C.3, that shows how we are considering what a benefit is to a disadvantaged community. And indeed, we're looking at the definition of a disadvantaged community. Right now, we have out a draft definition that is out for public comment. And we are expected to put out our final definition that will be re-upped each year. I believe next month is when we are finalizing the definition. So we have a draft NYSERDA disadvantaged community map, and that incorporates environmental justice communities. So within our solicitation, we reference that draft map and say when you're creating jobs or environmental benefits or workforce training partnerships, they need to be within these communities. So NYSERDA's overall goal, or what the goal is within the Climate Act itself, is 35% of overall spending, with a goal of 40% of overall spending and benefits must go to disadvantaged communities. So since that law was passed in 2019, we've been working on, okay, what is the definition of a disadvantaged community and what qualifies as a benefit? And both of those were heavily influenced by public comment periods. So for NYSERDA, again, we are looking for a 35% overall economic spend, and the benefits that we consider to disadvantaged communities are quite wide, and we think reasonable. So if you want to check it out, it's Appendix C3, and that was an appendix that was really formed by the incredible amount of public comments we received from our draft RFP.
Great, thank you, Jessica. And that actually spoke to another question that we had gotten about how disadvantaged or marginalized communities are defined in the context of offshore wind. And so there's a follow-up question there that I'm going to ask in a second, but I just didn't know if Bob or Marion wanted to speak to how your state tries to define disadvantaged communities or vulnerable communities.
I'll just step in for 1 second because first of all, Marion had a very good point we can't forget, and that is essentially metrics. Everybody can have a great idea and everybody can have a great community benefits plan that a developer provides you and the state approves, but 10 years down the road when the project's up and running, how much of it actually worked and who's responsible for ensuring that? In Connecticut, there are two sets of things. There is the statutes that require us to do this, and then there is the executive order, which established CJAC, which is sort of the watchdog advisory, but also directory council, who will be making sure that the correct number of benefits at a minimum go to the affected communities. There are two things I would like to raise though. First of all, each of the New England states, in fact, to my knowledge, almost every state in the country has different definitions. And that is one thing that going forward, we're gonna have to be conscious of, is that we have, what is a low income for a community? What is a disadvantaged community? And that's something that is not fully, is not absolutely the same from state to state. Also, and what that defines a benefit, we are finding out already has it's difficult to say exactly what benefits you should have when each community seems to have different needs. Some of our coastal communities versus some of our inland communities have very different needs. So we're going through the process we're having is having CJAC independently, analyze and assist us in this so that we can get, because it doesn't help if they're statutorily or otherwise required to provide X benefit, and that's not what the community in question needs. And so we're looking at the process through CJAC to do that and to double check the metrics, as Marion was saying.
Yeah, I can speak to the Massachusetts definition. So we have an environmental justice policy in Massachusetts that lays out the formal definition for environmental justice populations in the Commonwealth, and it involves multiple criteria, one of which is income compared to the statewide median. So like when you're looking at a specific community, how does their income compare to the statewide median? Minority population. And then also English language proficiency is another one of the criteria. So the EJ populations can be kind of a range of those three categories to be defined. So that is our definition that we use generally, which is set for kind of the entire Commonwealth to define environmental justice communities. And then also, so we use that we reference that in our RFP. But we also then, as I mentioned, we were working with our supplier diversity office, and they have a whole certification process that they use, and they have a variety of different types of certification. So you can be a minority-owned business, woman-owned, veteran-owned, LGBTQ-owned, and so we kind of deferred to their expertise. So we directed, in fact, I think when we issued the RFP, we invited the supplier diversity office to come present to the bidders, and we invited the bidders to reach out to the supplier diversity office to learn more about their certification process and how potential suppliers and contractors for these big offshore wind companies could start to work with those types of suppliers. So that was another kind of existing state office that does a lot of great work to support those minority-owned businesses. So we kind of leveraged their expertise and deferred to them in terms of those certification processes and definitions as well.
Well, thank you all for providing such detailed answers to those questions. Another question that's come up that's somewhat related to this is, and I'm again going to put to the whole group, is how have each of your states handled ocean co-users and specifically the fishing industry in your state? How have you tried to incorporate their needs into the overall development process, because those two ocean uses can sometimes clash? And we can, yeah, Marianne, you voted first, so we'll go to you.
I'm sure Jess and Bob can jump in too. Yeah, so we definitely have, from the start, environmental and impacts on the commercial fishing industry has been a big part of the qualitative evaluation that we've been conducting. And I'm probably not the best person to speak to this. I have really great colleagues who work in our coastal zone management office and our Department of Marine Fisheries who are working on the ground with the fishing industry stakeholders every day. So there is a fisheries working group in Massachusetts that's doing great work with the industry. And I usually lean on them for expertise here, but they were really helpful for providing input to us as we developed a new appendix to our RFP that was outlining what we want to see in kind of a fisheries mitigation plan from developers. So we got really helpful input from our state agency partners who are on the ground on this kind of thing to make sure that when we're evaluating a bid, we are evaluating that they have a robust plan to kind of avoid, minimize, mitigate, and compensate the commercial and recreational fishing industries with their projects. And that's also an area that our legislature has strengthened with our recent 2022 climate law. We have new provisions there outlining details around what we want to see in a fisheries mitigation plan from these offshore wind facilities. So this is an area where we've been seeing leadership from our legislature as well to ensure that stakeholder engagement is happening and that these projects are being responsible in their coexistence with other marine users.
Bob, I think you're muted there.
Yep, sorry. Interestingly, you've raised an interesting question, because this first came up in Connecticut in 2003 with the Cross-Sound cable, which was a development of a HVDC cable from New Haven to Shoreham on Long Island. And originally the cable route went right through the shellfishing beds, which have been very extensively used by Connecticut shellfishermen for literally centuries. And as a result, the shellfishing and fishing industries in Connecticut banded together and actually went to the Connecticut Attorney General's office and got the Attorney General's office to move the cable to another place. But the interesting result of that is that there was a very healthy dialogue between the other co-users of the ocean space, and not just the fishing industries, but others as well. And that has so Connecticut was very aware of this going into the whole procurement for offshore wind. So, and again, like Marianne, it's actually handled by a different group within the state, but I'm very familiar with what they've done. There was often an early engagement with the shellfishing industry. In addition, we worked with a development called the Blue Plan, which is the Connecticut, the CZMA plan for the Connecticut's portion of Long Island Sound. And I'm not sure if everyone's familiar with this. Long Island Sound is not federal, it's state. It's owned by New York, and the seafloor itself is owned by New York and Connecticut. So NYSERDA, myself, and others have been working to find the areas that we had to, absolute exclusion zones and protect, which often were shellfishing or other resource areas, and then work with the various fishermen. And we've had a very healthy dialogue with them. I would also point out that, and I think this is true in the New Bedford area as well, there's a significant Portuguese-speaking, fishing community. And in Connecticut, we've made sure that many of our meetings, we had translators available, have meetings after working hours so that we have access to the communities that are actually working. And this has been very, very helpful. So, and then we also participated in the NEPA process with BOEM on the footprint of the leasehold off Massachusetts to ensure that it ended up as a grid of 1 nautical mile by 1 nautical mile with the necessary corridors. So this was something we knew day one was going to happen. And to my knowledge and from the people I know who've been working on it, we've had a very successful engagement with those communities.
Yes, I'll just add in, echoing everything that Bob and Miriam have already said. You know, I'm not the expert on our fisheries stakeholder outreach or our marine stakeholder outreach. We have a dedicated and very talented group that does all of that effort, which is quite tremendous. We have a fisheries technical working group, we have a marine technical working group, we have an environmental technical working group, all comprised of existing marine and environmental ocean users. And we also require in our RFP that developers hire fishery liaison officers who know the industry. You know, up in Massachusetts, they have different fisheries than we do in New York, and even New York has different fisheries than New Jersey. So each state, even each lease, needs to look at fisheries outreach a little bit differently, but coordination across the states is required, because it's not as if, you know, fish just swim within one lease area. So we're trying to track all of the same data and engage the same stakeholder groups. You know, NYSERDA was a part of recommending the New York Bight lease areas after immense amount of research on those no-go zones that Bob was just mentioning. And in fact, you know, prior to the issuance of the very first offshore wind leases, NYSERDA worked with BOEM to collaborate on where the best and least impactful areas would be for offshore wind. So we continue to engage. We have a port liaison, we have a fisheries liaison, in those wonderful technical working groups. But again, I'm not the expert there, so I won't go into too much detail on what's done.
Well, despite none of you being the experts, you all were able to speak pretty knowledgeably. It seemed about each of your state's efforts to sort of mitigate the effects of offshore wind development on the fishing industry. I wanted to pivot a little bit to another question that we got, which was more about how can communities continue to be involved in the sort of offshore wind policy and development process in each of your states, because obviously it's not slowing down at all. It's picking up, and you know, I think despite perhaps all of us living in offshore wind world every day, I think there are a lot of people who are just starting to realize how big of an impact it's going to have, either on their community or on the regional economy, or just on their lives in general. So how can people and communities within your state continue to sort of be involved and stay abreast of all of the new developments? And I'll just, Jess, since you were talking, and this is your specialty a little bit, I'll come to you first.
Well, you know, the states, I think all of the states are trying to help communities with tools and resources to stay involved. You know, New York is on track to help communities with a one-stop shop information packet where you need to pay attention to permitting milestones and public hearings associated with project developments, where whether it be from a developer or from the permitting review that the Bureau of Ocean and Energy Management manages. So we want communities to know when their voices can be heard in the technical route and where they should be aware of it. And we also, again, with our new RFP, are tracking stakeholder outreach and engagement. And so we know a lot of the players. You know, NYSERDA is very lucky with the Climate Act, Climate Action Council, the scoping plan, the Climate Justice Working Group, to have, and even internally, we have the Energy and Climate Equity Team, our ECE team, that have created an immense stakeholder database within the environmental justice community. So a lot of outreach has been done so that we know who a lot of the players are that are going to be impacted by offshore wind or even the clean energy transition. And we do try to disseminate information to them with regards to project development and opportunities. But to be honest, you know, a lot of communities need, you know, the ones that have been the most successful in the space and taking advantage of opportunities and getting contracts or partnerships with training facilities are the ones that take the onus on themselves. You know, start Googling and start bookmarking and watching project schedules and attending webinars like this or state-run webinars so that you stay in the loop. You know, it's very important to take on the responsibility of monitoring these projects while the states are doing everything we can to empower and inform and make sure that developers and their contractors do the same. The best route is, you know, taking it on yourself and using every resource possible. And of course, you can email myself or anyone from the NYSERDA team to get on our outreach list, or ask us any questions at any time. But I would say, you know, the states are creating a lot of tools to help communities stay involved. That's definitely what we want and what our standard is and what our law says must be done. But to ensure the most success, you've got to educate yourself and take on that responsibility.
Yeah, I can add a bit from Massachusetts. Yeah, I think you raised a good point, Jess, which is like prompted me to think about, you know, there's for the state, at least certainly for my office, you know, a lot of our involvement is evaluating bids and selecting a project, but that's just the first step, right? And obviously it's a very important one. It's really important for, you know, these developers to get contracts with states so they can get financing and make the project real. But basically the rest of everything else is undertaken by the developer after, you know, they are selected for a contract with the state. And so there's that question of kind of community engagement with developers prior to them putting together a bid. And, you know, we are seeing developers do really cool partnerships with community-based organizations. A lot of these developers are trying to be really integrated into the coastal communities that they're working in, like New Bedford, Fall River, Salem, Massachusetts. And that is, you know, mutually beneficial where this is something the developers, it's going to help get their project built with skilled labor, and it's going to be helping the local community. But a lot of that development is going to be happening then after kind of the state involvement has tapered off, and it's just the kind of the project development phase. And so that's where, you know, the developers are going to be the ones really leading the engagement in those local communities and doing the outreach with those community groups. So certainly on the state side, you know, we try to make sure our process is transparent. You know, we're putting our RFPs out for public comment. We've been getting great engagement from advocacy and EJ groups. But then, you know, that's just the part up until a project is selected. And then there's a, you know, tremendous amount of, you know, remaining development and construction that's occurring. And I guess that MOU that I talked about where we're trying to kind of track and report, that's where the state can kind of play an ongoing role in making sure we're staying abreast of these developments, and that, you know, the way things are playing out is still reflective of the goals that were kind of agreed upon in the bid that was selected. So that was kind of my thought that came as Jess was speaking.
Yeah, and oh, sorry, Bob. One more thought for me, and then I don't mean to interrupt you. I just want to reiterate the importance of staying abreast of what the BOEM is doing, because BOEM is permitting or approving the major permits for these projects, the environmental impact statements, the construction and operation plans, and they have public hearings for those. And that's when you see, you know, the real guts of a project, how it's going to be built, and what all the mitigation plans are. So it's very important that communities stay abreast of those public hearings, I think, as well, and offer their input to those permitting applications. Okay, apologies, Bob, back over to you.
No, it was very important. In fact, I'm going to riff off your comment a little bit, because the BOEM process has been very transparent and open, and it's really excellent, particularly for dealing with the maritime interests, the fishing interests, shell fishing interests. They're very heavily engaged there, I would agree. Certainly with what Jess and Marion were saying. In Connecticut, we, of course, invite his comments as part of our RFP, RFI, and we found that we get a lot of very helpful comments on that, and we would encourage people to monitor websites. But in a positive sense, in a forward-going sense, what the state, DEEP in particular, does is that it continually reaches out to its community partners. We have a special officer, an equity officer, who does that, and is very well known to the community-based organizations and the environmental justice groups, and works with them. That's her job, and her staff as well. And there is a constant dialogue. And then, of course, there is also we even have an email, essentially service list of all the people that we know of who are interested in this, and we push documents out to them, and we push out the invitations to webinars and to virtual and, in some cases, physical meetings. We also have found that one of the things we can do a lot and help is having meetings, pre-meetings with our activist organizations, because some of this stuff gets really technical. substation development and design. And things like that are something that many of the community-based organizations are not going to be familiar with. So we actually try to work with them and meet with them to help explain these things, sometimes on a pre-meeting basis. Communication in technical subjects can be very, very difficult, and it's something that we're looking with interest on the Office of Public Participation at FERC and how they're doing it, because in fact, the leader of the Office of Public Participation used to work downstairs from me here in the office, Ellen Katz in Connecticut. And so we liaise with her because we're trying to, and we even in a multi-state effort filed comments with FERC to establish a technical specialist who can work with the Office of Public Participation to help support technical comments at FERC. We're starting to think that might be a good idea at the state level as well.
Well, thank you very much to all of you. Those were, oh, and Marion, go ahead if you've got something else.
Loop back and give props to CESA here too, because I found the work that you guys are doing through this initiative to bring states together with the community-based organizations was really cool and helpful. So definitely appreciate the role of sort of nonprofits like CESA and kind of convening and bringing together the dialogue between the states and the and community-based organizations on this topic.
Well, thank you very much, Marion. And we're trying our best. And as I mentioned before, this is new to a lot of people. So the engagement from everyone, whether you're an organized community group or just an individual, is really important in shaping how offshore power will be developed in the coming decades. I know we're running up a little bit close on time. We have about 4 minutes left. I just want to I have a couple of things. I just want to thank everyone who has asked a question. They've been really, really great questions. We're not going to be able to get to all of them in the webinar, but I will try my best to get answers from our panelists to some of the questions that you've asked. And I can send those to you in an email. And the other point of clarification was BOEM is the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, just for anyone who is unfamiliar with what BOEM is. And so with the remaining time, I thought a good question would just be, someone asked, where are each of your states in the offshore wind development process in terms of, how much has been developed and how much right now is perhaps under contract to be developed? I know that Jess, you mentioned this in one of your slides previously, but could all just quickly summarize, what you've done so far in terms of, how much has been developed, what are you working on, and what is your state's goal, if that's possible for all of you to answer. And I'll go to Jess first.
Oh gosh, I was trying to pull up a slide so I could give you the exact timeline. Go to somebody else first so I don't waste time.
Well, Bob, you've got some physical slides back there, so we'll.
Yes, I'm double checking now. Well, Connecticut, I can tell you definitely we've got 1,104 megawatts under contract. I can also verify, because we actually checked it with a marine search radar, that the first cables for our projects are actually in the water and being built. So, and I'm going to ask Marion to double check. I think we're at 4,700 for the 3 New England states.
I think that's right. Yeah, we've been writing a lot of regional documents. I think it's about 5 gigs for New England so far. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Okay.
Massachusetts, we have 3,200 megawatts of offshore wind under contract, which will represent, once online, about 25% of our electric load. So that's exciting. And then we have existing authorization to go all the way up to 5,600 megawatts total for Mass.
Yeah, for New York State, again, it's 9,000 megawatts by 2035. We currently have around 4,300 megawatts contracted directly. A smaller operational wind farm, or a smaller commercial scale wind farm, is going into operation for New York State at the end of this year. That's the South Fork Wind Farm. They are just off the coast of Montauk, and it's I think 11 turbines, and they have completed the work on getting their horizontal directional drilling, where you kind of bury underneath the ground at the beach. And it's the least environmentally impactful method of kind of burying a cable to come onshore. So they completed that in the last year, and they had a vessel out there laying the actual cable in the past couple of months. So that's been quite exciting, and they're about to start installing turbine foundations. The rest of our projects go into operation. The next one after South Fork Wind Farm would be Sunrise Wind, going into operation in 2025. Empire Wind 1 is expected operational in 2026. And then we have projects coming online almost every year after that in 2027 and 2028. And that is all, of course, contingent upon state and federal permitting allowing. So again, the first wind farm going into construction, it's already in construction now, looking to be operational by the end of the year. So those 4,300 megawatts is a little over half, or around half of our 9,000 megawatt goal. But we're actually even now looking into deeper waters in New York State. So we are launching a Master Plan 2.0 deep water to look at lease areas beyond the current existing ones, in case indeed we do need to go up to anywhere between 14 and 20 gigawatts of offshore wind to account for the electrification of the grid, right? So if we electrify all of our cars and appliances, we certainly will need more electricity on the grid, which means more offshore wind.
Well, thank you all. It's 4 o'clock. I was also just going to point out that right now, I think the question also asked, how much power is being generated now? It's about 42 megawatts being generated now between two sort of demonstration projects, one off of Rhode Island and one off of Virginia, and that Virginia one is going to be turned into a much larger project. So there is a lot to come. It's in its infancy here, but as you can see from everyone on the panel, it's taking off very quickly. So I just want to thank everyone for coming to this panel and asking wonderful questions, and I will let Vero close us out.
I don't want to close you out. I just want to add a quick plug, two quick plugs really. One is just mention learning about this topic. There's a wonderful webinar series that's been going for a long time now that NYSERDA is running. It's called Learning from the Expert. So Google that, Learning from the Expert NYSERDA. Really wonderful stuff. It's I highly recommend it. So that's plug number one. Plug number two is for something that's not quite actually out, but if you're interested in the space, you should definitely keep your ear to the ground. NREL is working on a guidebook or guide for communities. It's sort of a 101 for on offshore wind for communities. So that should be out by the end of the year, if my understanding is correct. So again, that's not out, but keep your eyes peeled for that. I think it will be really useful to just learn more about the space and to communicate about this fairly complicated topic. So thank you very much to everyone, and thank you to both SAMs for organizing this wonderful webinar.
Yes, it was our pleasure, Vero. And one final plug is if you go to the CESA website, you can read our offshore wind newsletter as well, which we've written to be try to be as accessible as possible to the widest possible audience. So thank you all for attending, and we hope you come back to some of our webinars in the future.